I want to tell you that I figured it out all at once, that there was one big, obvious moment where everything clicked, and I knew. That would make for a cleaner story. But the truth is messier than that. The truth is that I almost talked myself out of it a dozen times. Almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, sleep-deprived, ungrateful. Almost believed that a woman who had a good husband, a warm home, and a quiet life had no business looking for problems that were not there. Almost. My name is Nadia. I have been married to Grant Cole for 6 years, and for most of those 6 years, the last thing I did every single evening before winding down was drink a cup of tea that my husband made for me. That is where this story begins. It started as something sweet. In the early years of our marriage, Grant noticed that I had trouble switching off at night. I am a freelance graphic designer, which means my office is also my home, which means my brain never fully gets the message that the workday is over. I would sit at my desk until 10, 11, sometimes midnight, staring at a screen, convincing myself I just needed to finish one more thing. Grant was the one who introduced the tea ritual. Chamomile with a little honey. Every evening around 8 o'clock, he would appear at my office doorway holding a mug, and I would finally let myself stop. We would talk for a few minutes. Nothing serious. The kind of easy, low-stakes conversation that is the backbone of a real marriage. What we watched the night before. Something funny that happened during his workday. Plans for the weekend. Small things. Good things. Then I would finish the tea, wrap up whatever I was working on, and go to bed. I always slept well. I always woke up rested. I never thought twice about any of it. The first sign came on a Tuesday, about 3.5 weeks ago. I woke up on the couch at 6:30 in the morning, still in my work clothes, with no memory of how I got there. My laptop was closed on the coffee table. The lights in the hallway were off. Grant was already in the shower. I sat up slowly, my head thick and heavy, and tried to piece together the night before. I remembered the tea. I remembered drinking it at my desk. I remembered standing up to go to the bathroom. After that, nothing. A clean black cut. I told myself it was exhaustion. I had been working late all week on a branding project with a punishing deadline. The body finds a way to take what it needs. I got up, splashed water on my face, and moved on with my day. The second time it happened was that Friday. Same thing. Woke up disoriented, fully dressed, no memory of the hours between 8 in the evening and 6 in the morning. This time I was in bed, which was something, but the lights on my side were still on. Grant had turned off his own lamp and gone to sleep beside me without waking me. When I mentioned it at breakfast, he smiled and said I had fallen asleep mid-sentence while telling him about a client email. He said it gently. He said it fondly. He said it like a man telling a small, harmless story about his tired wife. I laughed. I believed him. I moved on. The third time I paid attention. It was a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the first incident, and I was at my desk when Grant brought the tea. We talked for a bit. He mentioned that Dennis might come by that weekend. I said that was fine. We talked about nothing, the way we always did. He left. I drank the tea. But this time, before the heaviness came, I noticed the heaviness coming. It was not gradual the way real tiredness feels. The slow dimming of energy over hours. This was something else. It was sudden. A warmth that started in my chest and moved outward to my fingers and the backs of my knees. My thoughts became slow and wide, like something spreading through water. I remember thinking, clearly and specifically, this does not feel like being tired. And then I was gone. I woke up at 6:43 the next morning. Bedroom. Lights off. Fully undressed this time in my pajamas with no memory of changing. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I did not say anything to Grant that morning. I smiled over breakfast. I asked about his day. I watched his face the way you watch the face of someone you love when you are suddenly, horribly unsure of what is behind it. His face gave me nothing. It was the same face it had always been. Steady, warm. The face of a man who makes your tea every evening and remembers how much honey you like and never misses an anniversary. I went into my office and I sat down and I thought about all 3 incidents, the pattern of them, the specific and consistent timing, always after the tea, always around the same hour, always resulting in a kind of sleep so deep it left no impression. I thought about whether I was sick, or whether something was wrong with me physically. I turned it over in every direction, trying to find the version of events that did not require me to suspect my husband of anything. I found two. The first night, Grant had a late site meeting, one of those emergency situations at work that pulled him out of the house until nearly 10. I had made my own tea. Badly, because I never pay attention when he makes it and did not know where he kept the chamomile. I ended up drinking plain green tea I found at the back of a cupboard, and I went to bed normally that night. Restlessly, waking twice, checking my phone, lying in that shallow half-sleep that I used to consider ordinary. The second night was a Saturday 2 weeks before the first incident. I had completely forgotten about tea because we had friends over and the evening ran long, and by the time everyone left, I just went straight to bed. That night, same thing. Light sleep. Normal. On every other night. Every night the tea appeared at my desk at 8 o'clock made by my husband's hands. I slept like I had been switched off. Tell me what to do with that. I started testing it quietly. On nights when I sensed something was off, I would take small sips instead of finishing the mug. Those nights I slept lighter. On nights I drank the full cup, I was gone by 9 and did not surface until morning. I ran this experiment for 5 days in a row without Grant knowing. The results were the same every time. By the end of the 5th day, I was sitting at my desk with a mug of untouched tea in front of me and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as grief. Because suspecting something and having evidence that points toward it are two very different experiences. One lives in your imagination, the other lives in your body. Then came the look. It was a Thursday evening, 8 days ago. Grant had just set the mug on my desk, and I had just wrapped both hands around it the way I always did. I was looking at my screen. But in the reflection of my monitor, faint, slightly warped, I could see the doorway behind me. Grant had not left yet. He was standing just inside the doorframe, one shoulder leaning against the wood, and he was watching me. Not the way someone watches a person they love, not with softness. With something that was far more focused than that. He was watching my hands, watching the mug. And there was something in his expression, something patient and deliberate, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight. I did not react. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the screen and waited. And after a moment I heard his footsteps move back down the hallway toward the kitchen. I set the mug down and did not touch it again. That night, I lay awake beside my husband and listened to him breathe, slow and even and completely unbothered. The tea was still on my desk downstairs, going cold. I had poured most of it into the soil of the small potted plant beside my monitor and left just enough in the mug to look convincing. Grant slept soundly. I did not sleep at all. I lay there in the dark, running through every explanation, every alternative, every reason a good man might do something like this, and I kept arriving at the same wall. The same question I did not yet have the answer to. Why? Not what? Not how? Why? Because whatever was happening in my home, whatever my husband was doing, and whatever his reason was, I needed to understand it before I did anything else. I needed to be sure. And I was going to find out. There is a specific kind of fear that does not make you scream. It does not make you run or cry or shake. It settles into you quietly, like cold water rising, and it makes you very, very still. That was the fear I was living in during those days. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that follows you into every room and sits beside you at the breakfast table and watches you smile at your husband while your mind is somewhere else entirely. I became two people almost overnight. There was the Nadia that Grant saw. Warm, normal, occasionally distracted by work, drinking her evening tea, going to bed at a reasonable hour. And then there was the other Nadia, the one doing calculations behind her eyes, the one replaying that reflection in the monitor screen over and over. The one who had stopped sleeping not because of any pill, but because her own thoughts would not leave her alone. I functioned. I answered client emails. I revised logo concepts and sent invoices and laughed at the right moments during dinner. I was so normal that it frightened me a little. How easily I could perform a life while quietly dismantling it from the inside. Grant left for work at 7:45 every morning. He was consistent about it. The way he was consistent about most things. He kissed me on the cheek, told me what time he expected to be home, and walked out to his car. I would hear the engine, hear the reverse out of the driveway, and then the house would go quiet. I gave it 10 minutes the first morning, just in case he forgot something and turned back. Then I started moving. I was not sure what I was looking for exactly. That was the uncomfortable part. I was a woman searching her own home for evidence against her own husband, and I did not even have a clear picture of what that evidence would look like. And all I knew was what I had already felt and observed. The pattern of the sleep, the bottle of pills I had not yet found but somehow already knew existed. That look in the doorway. I was working on instinct more than logic. I followed the feeling. I started in the bedroom, his side of the wardrobe first. The shelves above the hanging clothes where he kept folded jumpers and an old shoebox of cables and chargers he never used but refused to throw away. I went through everything carefully, putting each item back exactly as I found it, smoothing the folds of fabric, replacing the box at the same angle. Nothing. I checked the nightstand. A novel he had been reading for 4 months and would probably never finish. Chapstick, a phone charger, a receipt from a petrol station folded in half. I unfolded it. Ordinary. I put it back. I checked under the mattress, feeling along the edges with my hand. Nothing. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around at all of it. Our bed, our curtains, the framed photo of us on our honeymoon in Portugal on his dresser, and felt the particular sadness of looking at a life you built and wondering what is hidden inside it. The bathroom came next. Under the sink first, where we kept spare toiletries, cleaning supplies, an old first aid kit. I went through the first aid kit slowly. Plasters, antiseptic, a crinkled leaflet about burns, some old cold medicine. Nothing that matched what I was looking for. I checked the cabinet above the sink, his side, then mine. Ordinary things. Deodorant, shaving foam, a prescription for the mild blood pressure medication he had been on for 2 years, which I already knew about. I put everything back and moved on. I checked his home office next. This felt different from the other rooms. More loaded, more deliberate. His office was his private space. Not off limits exactly, but not somewhere I wandered into casually. I stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. There was a desk, a filing cabinet, a shelf of project binders from work, a small safe in the corner that held our passports and insurance documents and which we both had the code to. I opened the safe. Passports, insurance, our marriage certificate in its original envelope, a small amount of emergency cash, nothing else. The filing cabinet was full of work documents, bank statements, utility bills going back years. I flipped through them without pulling anything out. Everything was in order. Grant was meticulous about these things, and he had always been the organized one between us. I left the office feeling like I had proven nothing except that my husband was tidy. I almost stopped after that first morning. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and sat there with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, feeling the first real edge of doubt about my own suspicions. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the sleep was just exhaustion. Maybe the look in the doorway was just a man watching his wife and thinking whatever quiet thoughts people think. Maybe the 2 nights of normal sleep were coincidences and I had built an entire architecture of suspicion out of 2 data points and 1 reflection in a monitor screen. I wanted to believe that. I genuinely did. But I went back the next morning, and the morning after that. It was the 3rd morning of searching when I found it. I had moved into the kitchen, which I had avoided until then because it felt too ordinary, too shared. I started with the drawers, the junk drawer, the utensil drawer, the one near the stove where we kept takeaway menus we never looked at. Then the cupboards, spices, tinned goods, the good plates we only used for guests. I was working my way methodically from left to right, and I nearly skipped the cabinet above the refrigerator. It was high up. I needed to pull a chair over to reach it, and we had not used it in years. I knew what was up there. An old tin of instant coffee that belonged to Grant's mother, a stack of takeaway menus older than the ones in the drawer, 2 mugs with the handles broken off that we kept meaning to throw away. I had not been inside that cabinet since we moved in. I climbed onto the chair. I moved the broken mugs to one side. I moved the old menus. I reached for the tin of instant coffee, and my fingers touched something behind it. Small, cylindrical, plastic. I pulled it out. It was an orange prescription bottle, standard size, the kind you get from any pharmacy. The label had been interfered with, not fully removed, but scratched and smeared in a way that made most of it unreadable. Someone had taken something sharp, a key or a thumbnail, and dragged it across the printed text deliberately. The pharmacy name was gone. The patient name was gone. The prescribing doctor was gone. But 2 things had survived. The medication name, partially legible, enough letters intact for me to read it clearly, and the dosage. And I am not going to pretend I knew exactly what I was holding from the name alone. I did not. I came down from the chair, set the bottle on the kitchen counter, and typed the medication name into my phone with hands that were not entirely steady. The results came back in seconds. It was a sedative. A strong one, prescribed typically for severe insomnia or acute anxiety. The dosage on the scratched label was not a low dose. It was the kind of amount that would put someone under hard and keep them there. I stood in my kitchen in the morning light and stared at my phone screen for a long time. I took a photograph of the bottle from 3 angles. Then I put it back behind the tin, exactly as I had found it. I climbed down, replaced the chair, and stood at the kitchen sink and ran the cold tap and held my wrists under it, because that is something my mother taught me when I was young, and I still do it when I need to slow my heart down. It helped a little. I went to my office. I opened my laptop. I stared at a design file I was supposed to be working on and saw nothing on the screen. That evening, Grant made the tea. He carried it to my desk the way he always did, set it down gently, smiled at me. He asked how the project was going. I said fine. I asked about his day. He told me about a problem on one of the sites, a delivery delay, a supplier issue, the usual frustrations. He was relaxed and present, and completely, perfectly ordinary. I watched his hands as he set the mug down. Careful, deliberate. The hands of a man I had held in a hospital waiting room when his father was sick. The hands of a man who had danced with me badly and happily at our wedding reception. I watched those hands and I felt something crack quietly in the middle of my chest. He went upstairs to shower. I picked up my phone and called Patrice. She answered on the second ring. I kept my voice low, barely above a whisper, and I told her everything. The sleep, the pattern, the cabinet above the refrigerator, the bottle with the scratched label. She listened without interrupting, which is not something Patrice normally does, and that silence told me everything about how seriously she was taking it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We need to know why." 4 words, but they landed like a full sentence, like a decision. Like a door swinging open, like the beginning of something neither of us could take back. I heard the front door then, a knock, followed immediately by it opening, the way someone does when they have been coming to a place long enough to feel comfortable not waiting. Grant's voice from upstairs, surprised and warm, calling out a greeting. I moved to the top of the stairs and looked down. Dennis was standing in the hallway below, unwinding his jacket, grinning that wide, easy grin of his. But it was not Dennis that held my attention. It was Grant who had come halfway down the stairs to meet him, and whose entire body, the set of his shoulders, the way he dropped his voice immediately, had changed the moment he laid eyes on his best friend, like a man who had been waiting. Patrice arrived at 8:45 the following evening. She did not come inside. That was the plan. She parked 2 houses down on the opposite side of the street, in her grey car, with her phone charged and her location shared with mine. Before she left her own house, she had sent me a single message. "I'm here. You've got this. Do not rush." I read it 3 times standing in the bathroom with the door locked. The plan itself was not complicated. That was the point. We had been over it twice on the phone the night before and once more that afternoon, and both times Patrice had said the same thing. Keep it simple. Keep it clean. Do not improvise. Grant would bring the tea around 8 o'clock the way he always did. When he stepped away, even briefly, I would pour it out. The small potted plant beside my desk, a snake plant that had survived 3 years of my neglect, had been moved that morning to the left side of the desk, within easy reach of my right hand, close enough that I could tip the mug without standing up. I would leave just enough liquid at the bottom to look convincing. Then I would perform. Drowsiness first. I had watched myself fall asleep in the early days, before I understood what was happening, and I tried to remember what it looked like from the outside. The gradual slowing, the way my head would dip once before I caught it, the way I would shift on the chair and then stop shifting, like something winding down. I had practiced it briefly in the bathroom mirror that afternoon and felt ridiculous, but I did it anyway. Preparation mattered. One wrong movement. One eye that opened at the wrong moment, and it was over. I would move to the couch. I had done that naturally on some of the earlier nights. I must have made it there on my own before going fully under, so it would not look strange. I would lie down, slow my breathing, and stay absolutely still. And then I would listen. Grant came home at 6:30 that evening. He was in a good mood, which made everything harder. He had stopped at the shop on the way back and bought ingredients for the pasta dish I liked, and he made it from scratch while I sat at the kitchen island and talked to him about nothing. He poured himself a small glass of wine. He offered me one. I said I would wait until after I finished the section of work I was trying to get through. He nodded and stirred the sauce and told me about something funny that had happened during a site inspection that afternoon. I laughed at the right moment. I asked a follow-up question. I ate the pasta and said it was good, which it was, because Grant was a genuinely good cook, and that was one of the many true and uncomplicated things about him that made all of this so much harder to sit with. After dinner, I went to my office. I moved the plant. I opened a design file and stared at it. At 8:03, I heard his footsteps on the stairs. He knocked twice on the open door the way he always did. A small habit, a courtesy, as if my office were its own country that deserved to be entered properly. I turned in my chair and smiled at him. He was holding the mug in both hands, steam rising from it slowly, and he was smiling back at me with the same face he had worn every evening for 6 years. I took the mug. I wrapped my hands around it. We talked. He asked how the work was going. I said I was almost done with a section. He mentioned that the weather was supposed to turn colder at the end of the week and that we should probably dig out the heavier blankets from the top shelf of the wardrobe. I said I would do it tomorrow. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, easy and unhurried, and then said he was going to go down and clean up the kitchen. He turned and left. I waited until I heard his footsteps reach the bottom of the stairs. Then I lifted the mug, tilted it toward the plant, and poured. The soil darkened and the steam disappeared, and I set the mug back in my hands and looked at what remained. A thin layer of liquid at the bottom, pale and unconvincing if you looked closely, but enough. I arranged myself in the chair. I let my shoulders drop. I let my eyes go soft, the way they had been in the bathroom mirror. And I sat like that for a few minutes, waiting for him to come back up and check. He did not come back up. After about 15 minutes, I let my head dip once, slowly, and then I pushed myself up from the chair with the careful, clumsy movement of someone fighting sleep they cannot win against. I carried the mug to the desk surface, set it down. I walked to the couch on the other side of the office. We kept a small 2-seater in there for when I needed to step away from the screen. And I lay down on my side, facing the back of it, one arm tucked under my head. I pulled my breathing in, long and slow. And I waited. The house was quiet in a way that felt purposeful. I could hear the distant sound of water running in the kitchen, then stopping. The soft thud of a cabinet being closed. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a Tuesday evening in a house where everything was fine. I focused on keeping my body completely still and let my mind stay sharp underneath the stillness, the way an animal goes quiet in tall grass. 10 minutes passed, maybe 12. Then I heard his footsteps at the bottom of the stairs again, coming up slowly. Not the quick, casual climb of someone just passing through, deliberately slow, one step at a time. I regulated my breathing. I felt my own heartbeat and willed it to calm down. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. I could not see him from where I was lying. I was facing the couch back, but I felt the change in the air the way you feel it when a door opens in a warm room. Not a sound exactly. A presence. He was standing in the doorway, looking at me. Looking, I imagined, at the mug on the desk, and then at the shape of me on the couch, and then perhaps at the mug again. I did not move. I did not change my breathing. After a long moment, long enough that I had to concentrate to hold the stillness, I heard him take one step inside the room. Then he stopped again. The silence stretched. Then he stepped back out. His footsteps moved down the hallway toward our bedroom, unhurried, and I heard the soft sound of that door pulling mostly closed. I let out a breath so slowly it barely made a sound. I lay there for another 10 minutes, not moving, listening. The house settled into its nighttime noises, the creak of the walls, the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. My phone was face down in my back pocket, vibrating silently against my hip. Patrice checking in. I could not respond. Then, at 9:40, I heard something that straightened every nerve in my body. Grant's voice, low, deliberate. Not the voice he used when he was on the phone with his mother or a colleague from work. A different register entirely. Hushed and clipped. The voice of a man who did not want to be heard. He was in the bedroom with the door pulled to, and I could not make out words, only the rhythm and the tone was serious. Then a pause. Then, "A name," said once, clearly enough to carry through the near-closed door and down the hallway and reach me on the couch with my eyes wide open in the dark. Dennis. Another pause. Then two more things spoken quickly, one after the other. A place I recognized, and a time. Tomorrow night. Then silence. I lay absolutely still and stared at the back of the couch and felt the shape of something I did not yet fully understand pressing against the inside of my chest. 20 minutes later, I heard the front door. Not from upstairs, from below. The particular sound of our front door, the slight resistance of it, the specific click of the latch, followed by footsteps in the entrance hall that were not Grant's. A second set of footsteps had just walked into my house. Grant's voice came from the top of the stairs, barely above a murmur. And from below, quieter still, a response. I knew that voice. I knew it the way you know the voices of people who have sat at your dinner table and laughed in your kitchen and called you by your first name for years. I pushed myself upright on the couch in the dark and sat there with my heart going loud and fast in my chest. And I began, very carefully, to move. The trick to moving through a dark house without being heard is to stop thinking about the destination and start thinking about each individual step. That is what I told myself as I lifted my weight from the couch with both hands pressed flat against the cushions. Slow, no springs, no shift of fabric that would carry. I had no shoes on, which helped. Socked feet on hardwood are nearly silent if you place them right. Heel first, rolling forward, no slap of sole against floor. I crossed the office in 8 steps. The hallway outside was dim, lit only by the thin strip of light coming from under the bedroom door to my left. I could hear them below me now. Not words yet, just the low, careful murmur of two people who did not want to be overheard. Moving through the entrance hall. Then the sound of another door, Grant's office at the far end of the ground floor corridor, opening and closing. I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down into the dark entrance hall below. Empty now. They had gone in. I started down. I knew these stairs. I knew which step was the third from the bottom and creaked no matter where on it you placed your foot, and I skipped it entirely, stepping over it in one long stride and landing on the fourth with barely a sound. The entrance hall was cold. We kept the heating on a timer and it had clicked off an hour ago. I stood still for a moment and let my eyes adjust and listened. The office door was not fully closed. I could see the thin vertical line of warm light at its edge from where I stood at the end of the corridor. I moved toward it. I positioned myself with my back flat against the wall, just to the left of the gap, close enough that I could see a narrow slice of the room inside, the corner of Grant's desk, the arm of the chair, the edge of the shelving unit, and close enough that their voices, still low but no longer muffled, reached me clearly. Dennis was speaking first. He was sitting from the sound of it. His voice had that slight forward lean of someone resting their elbows on their knees, directed downward rather than across. Grant was somewhere to the right, out of my line of sight. I could hear him breathing, measured, controlled in the way that told me he was not relaxed. He was managing something. I pressed my back against the wall and I listened. What I heard in the first few minutes did not make sense to me. Not because the words were unclear, but because the picture they were drawing did not match any of the pictures I had already drawn in my own head. I had spent weeks building theories. I had a whole architecture of suspicion constructed carefully from sleepless nights and quiet observations, and a scratched prescription bottle pulled from behind an old tin of coffee. I had theories about other women, about money, about something secret and ugly that Grant had been hiding from me behind 6 years of chamomile tea and anniversary dinners and a face that never gave anything away. None of my theories looked like this. Dennis was talking about a date. Not a date between two people. A date on a calendar. Sometime in the next 3 weeks, he said. He used the word window. A narrow window, and they needed to be ready when it came. Grant said something back, too quiet for me to catch fully, and Dennis responded with a number. A figure, said plainly, without drama. The way people say numbers when they have already had the dramatic conversation about them and are now just working with the facts. The number was significant. Significant enough that I felt it land in my chest, even though I did not yet understand what it was for. Then Grant spoke more clearly and I caught it. She can't know yet, not until I'm sure it's going to work. She. Me. I was she. I was the person Grant was making sure could not know yet. And the sedatives, the careful, methodical sedatives, had something to do with making sure of that. But why? I stood in that corridor, and I turned the pieces over. Grant needed me asleep. He needed specific evenings, not every night, but selected ones, where he could be certain I was deeply under and would not surface unexpectedly. He needed those evenings to do something that involved Dennis and a narrow window and a significant amount of money and a timeline of 3 weeks. The version of events I had been constructing, the dark version, the frightening version, the version where my husband was something other than what I believed him to be, began to shift on its foundations. It did not collapse, but it moved, rearranged itself into a shape I had not considered. I pressed my palms flat against the wall behind me and kept listening. Dennis said something about paperwork, about signatures that still needed to be collected, and a third party who was being difficult about timing. Grant made a sound of frustration. Not anger exactly, more the sound of someone managing a situation that kept developing new complications. He said the third party needed to be handled carefully, that they could not afford to spook anyone at this stage. Then Dennis laughed. It was a short, quiet laugh, nothing like the big room-filling laugh I knew from dinner tables and summer barbecues. This was smaller and more tired. The laugh of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a while and had found a single moment of lightness in it. He said, "She's going to lose her mind. You know that." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. That's why I need more time." I felt something shift inside me then. Something that had been held very tight for weeks began, very slightly, to loosen. Not because I understood. I still did not understand, not fully, but the tone of what I was hearing, the texture of it. The specific emotional temperature had changed underneath me without my permission. These were not the sounds of deception in the way I had feared. They were not cold or calculating or cruel. They were the sounds of two men trying to get something right, trying to manage something carefully, trying to protect someone from knowing a thing too soon, trying to protect me. I do not know exactly when the tears started. I did not notice them until I felt the cold of one running along the side of my jaw, and by then there were already others following it. I was not crying the way you cry when something breaks. I was crying the way you cry when something you braced against turns out not to be the thing you feared, and your body releases 6 weeks of held tension all at once without asking your permission first. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I needed to think. I needed to step back from the door and find a wall somewhere in my own head and put my back against it and think clearly. Because I still did not have the full picture. I had pieces, better pieces, softer pieces, but not the whole thing. And the whole thing mattered. The sedatives still mattered. A man who loves you and means well is still a man who made a decision about your body and your sleep without asking you. And that required an answer regardless of what the reason turned out to be. I straightened up. I steadied my breathing. And then, I did the thing I had not planned to do. I pushed the door open, not forcefully, not dramatically. I just placed my hand flat against the wood and let it swing inward and stepped into the light. They both turned at exactly the same moment. Grant was behind his desk, half risen from his chair, papers spread in front of him. And for a fraction of a second, his face was completely unguarded. Whatever careful composure he had been maintaining in that room dissolved the instant he saw me standing in the doorway in my socked feet, with my eyes red and my face giving away every single thing I had been holding in the dark hallway for the past 20 minutes. He looked at me the way a person looks when they have been found, not caught exactly, found. There is a difference. Being caught implies something shameful. Being found implies something more complicated. Something that had been hidden not out of malice, but out of something harder to name. Dennis stood up from his chair slowly. He looked at Grant. Then he looked at me. And the expression on his face was not the expression of a man with something to hide. It was the expression of a man who understood exactly what was about to happen and felt the weight of it. Neither of them said anything. I looked at my husband. At this man with his unguarded face and his spread papers and his hands open at his sides. And I felt 6 weeks of fear and sleeplessness and grief and quiet, desperate investigation pressing against the back of my throat. I said the only thing I could think to say. "Tell me everything." Grant did not look away from me. That was the first thing I noticed. A guilty man looks away, He finds the floor, the wall, the middle distance, anywhere that is not the face of the person he has wronged. Grant looked directly at me, and what was in his eyes was not guilt in the way I had feared it for weeks. It was something older and more complicated than guilt, something that had clearly been sitting behind his eyes for a long time, waiting for exactly this moment to finally come forward. Dennis picked up his jacket from the back of the chair without a word. He looked at Grant once, a look that passed between them, the way looks do between people who have known each other for decades, entire conversations compressed into a single second. And then he looked at me and said, quietly, that he was sorry. Not the sorry of someone apologizing for wrongdoing, the sorry of someone who understood that what was about to happen in this room was going to be hard and who wished, genuinely, that it did not have to be. He stepped past me into the hallway and pulled the office door closed behind him. I heard the front door a minute later. And then, it was just us. Grant came around from behind the desk slowly. He did not come toward me. He just moved to the front of it and leaned against the edge of it and looked at me across the small space between us. The papers I had glimpsed from the doorway were still spread behind him. I could not read them from where I stood. I did not look at them yet. I kept my eyes on his face. He said my name. Just that. The way he had said it on our wedding day. Actually, not loudly, not for anyone else, just for me, as if it was something he was reminding himself of. Then he started talking. 8 months ago, Grant had found out something about a property. Not a work property, nothing to do with his firm. A private matter. An old building on the edge of a town 2 hours from where we lived. One that had belonged to his grandmother before she died and had passed through a complicated chain of family decisions and legal ambiguity in the years since. Grant had been quietly investigating the ownership status for almost 2 years, working with Dennis, who had a contact in property law, trying to untangle something that the family had left knotted for decades. 4 months ago, they found a clear path through. The building, which had been sitting empty and deteriorating for years, could be reclaimed, restored, and transferred legally into Grant's name and subsequently into ours. It was not a small thing. The building itself was substantial, and the land it sat on more so. What Grant had been working toward, in secret, across months of carefully managed paperwork and third-party negotiations and a timeline that kept shifting, was the transfer of an asset that would change the shape of our future entirely. He had not told me because he had been afraid it would fall through. That was the first thing he said, and he said it plainly, without dressing it up. He had been down this road twice before in the 2 years prior. Twice he had believed they were close, twice the path had collapsed under new legal complications, and both times he had said nothing to me because both times there had been nothing concrete to say. He could not bear to build something in my imagination and then watch it crumble. He knew me. He knew that I would hold on to it, that I would let myself want it, and that losing it a third time after letting myself want it would hurt in a way that felt preventable. So he said nothing. He kept it separate. He managed it quietly, the way he managed most things, and he waited until he was sure. The sedatives was something else, a different thread in the same knot. 3 months ago, Dennis's contact, the third party Grant had mentioned, the one being difficult about timing, had begun to stall. Not pulling out entirely, but creating delays, asking for additional documentation, rescheduling meetings at the last minute. Grant became convinced the man was fishing for information, trying to determine whether there were other interested parties, whether the urgency was real. Grant and Dennis had started meeting in the evenings to manage the correspondence in real time, coordinating responses, handling the legal contact directly rather than going through intermediaries. Those evenings needed to be private, not because Grant was ashamed of what he was doing, but because our home was small and open, and I worked late and moved freely through it, and Grant had learned on 2 separate evenings early on that I had wandered into the vicinity of his office at exactly the wrong moment. Once I had knocked and asked if he wanted tea while he was mid-call. Once I had opened the door to ask about a delivery, and he had been on the phone with Dennis talking figures. He had deflected both times, but the close calls had shaken him. And so, in a moment of thinking that he would later describe to me as the worst decision he had made in years, he had begun adding a small amount of the sedative to my evening tea on the nights when he and Dennis needed to work. Not every night. Only on the specific evenings when something time-sensitive was happening and he needed to be certain. He had told himself it was harmless. He had told himself it was temporary. He had the prescription from a period 18 months ago when he himself had been struggling with sleep after a difficult stretch at work, and he had reasoned, in the quiet private logic of someone doing something they do not want to examine too closely, that the dose was small and the duration would be short. He had never once, he said, considered what it would feel like from the inside. He stopped talking. The room was very quiet. I had been standing in the same spot since Dennis left. And somewhere during Grant's account I had crossed my arms, not in anger exactly, more in the way you hold yourself together when something is pulling at the seams of you from several directions at once. I was not crying anymore. I was past crying. I was in that dry, clear, very still place that comes after crying, where everything feels slightly too bright, and your thoughts move slowly, but with great precision. I looked at my husband. I thought about the weeks of lying awake beside him. The mornings of waking up displaced from myself, in my clothes, in the wrong room, reaching for the thread of the previous night and finding nothing. I thought about the cold water on my wrists at the kitchen sink. I thought about Patrice parked 2 houses down in the dark with her phone charged and her location shared. And I thought about the potted plant with the tea in its soil and the orange bottle behind the instant coffee tin and all the quiet, careful, frightened work I had done to arrive at this room. And I thought about what he had actually been doing. The reason underneath the reason. That was the hardest part, because the reason underneath the reason was love. A particular kind of love, flawed and unilateral and poorly executed, but love in its intention. A man who wanted to build something for his wife, who had been afraid of disappointing her a third time, who had made a decision he had no right to make and wrapped it in a motive that was genuine, and in doing so had created something that felt, from the outside, like the worst thing she had ever imagined. Good intentions do not make a wrong thing right. I knew that. I needed him to know that I knew that. I uncrossed my arms. I sat down in the chair across from his desk, Dennis's chair still slightly warm, and I looked at Grant, and I told him to sit down too. He did. And then I talked. I told him what the past 6 weeks had actually been, not the version he had seen, the normal Nadia, the smiling Nadia, the Nadia finishing her tea and going quietly to sleep. The real version, the lying awake, the searching the house alone while he was at work, the photograph of the bottle on my phone, the calls to Patrice, the evenings of pouring the tea into the plant soil while he cleaned the kitchen downstairs. I told him about practicing falling asleep in the bathroom mirror. I told him about Patrice parked outside right now, this very moment, 2 houses down, or waiting for a message that everything was all right. I watched his face move through things as I spoke. Shock first, then something worse than shock. The specific horror of a person confronting the gap between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing to someone else. By the time I finished, he had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed like that for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He said, "I didn't think about what it felt like from your side. I only thought about mine." I said, "I know." I said, "That's the problem." We talked until the sky outside the office window went from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn. At some point I texted Patrice, "I'm okay. Go home. I'll call you tomorrow." And I imagined her sitting in that grey car reading it, exhaling, driving away into the early morning. Not everything was resolved by the time the light changed. Some things cannot be resolved in a single night, and pretending otherwise would be a dishonesty I was no longer willing to offer. There was real damage. There was trust that had been handled carelessly by someone who should have known better. And trust is not a thing you restore with one honest conversation, however long, however genuine. But something had been returned to me in that room. Something I had not realized I was missing until I felt it come back. Not certainty about the future, not a guarantee. Just the feeling of standing on ground that was real again, even if it was uneven, even if there was still a long way to walk across it. Grant reached across the desk at some point and placed his hand over mine. He did not say anything. He just left it there. I looked at our hands. I thought about 6 years. I thought about the tea ritual and how it had started as something genuinely tender and how it had ended up here, in this office at 4 a.m, and how the distance between those two things was a map of every small decision that had quietly accumulated into something neither of us had intended. I did not pull my hand away, but I did not move it toward him either. I just let it rest there, in the space between what we had been and whatever came next, and I sat with the uncertainty of that, and I breathed through it, and I waited for the morning.